Purposeful. Amazing. Thank you so much. So before we begin, a quick land acknowledgement, as we always do. And as all of you, or many of you, are in very different locations, and the land acknowledgement would look differently. I am in Toronto, so we'll do the land acknowledgement for Toronto. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as always, we'd also like to encourage you to not just have these land acknowledgements as we are together in meetings, but also during your everyday life, give consideration to the land you're situated upon. Now, we do have an exciting program planned for today. We're right now in the midst of the welcome, and we'll do a little bit a quick icebreaker. After that, Sandra will present. And after that, we should have ample time for questions and discussion. At the very end, I'll give a couple of quick updates about the FEI before we close the meeting for today. Now, for those that haven't been with us, and that's quite a few people today, for those that haven't been with us before, just a couple of words about the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. Firstly, the word flourishing. We have someone in the meeting today that could say a lot more about that than I will do now, John. But just a couple of words. The word flourishing for us is a perspective on sustainability that goes beyond the traditional perspective of sustainability as aiming to maintain the status quo. And rather than that, flourishing is a scientifically grounded vision that's focused on realizing the full potential of individuals, communities, and ecosystems for generations to come. And so as we work on Flourishing, the Flourishing Enterprise Institute is a research and innovation network for stewarding enterprises that are capable of enhancing the well-being of their communities and wider ecosystems. We were founded in 2019 in Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. We're housed at Veris at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo and at OCAD University in Toronto. And currently, we're operating on funding granted to us by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. So after these few introductory slides, just a little bit of a quick icebreaker, nothing too big, but we'd like to get you engaged a little bit as well, because we're going to have a bit of a discussion later. And I know it can be tough when we're all sitting in front of our screens just to be the first one to, ask a question or make a comment, which we very much encourage you to do. And so the quick icebreaker for today is simply, which word best describes you today? Now, you can put your answer in the chat, that's totally fine, but it would be awesome if you just felt like unmuting and sharing with us how you feel today or which word best describes you today. So please feel free to go ahead now and share about your day. That's great. I already see Milena said cake. That's an interesting word. Milena, oh, your partner's birthday was yesterday. Well, tell him happy birthday from all of us. I hope the cake is great.
Let's say I'll just say re-envisioning.
Re-envisioning. Would you like to say a couple of words about that, Peter?
Well, I've just stuck my neck out to propose OCAD University as the host for the RSD 14 conference next year. We didn't have any other volunteers for a location. This year it's back in Oslo, and it hasn't actually been hosted in Toronto since 2016. So we're due. But so re-envisioning a lot of things.
Amazing. Congratulations for that. That's great.
Everybody come next year.
Absolutely. Well, we have a couple of, oh, sorry. Yes, please.
I always use a word that's not a word. So it's, there's never any rules that said it has to be a word you find in the dictionary. So, with my interest in well-being and quality life and happiness, I've sort of and my sort of massively transformative purpose, it's all around the word Wellamundi, which is basically Wella, which is Old English for well-being, and Mundi for the world. So it's so I think it's appropriate for today's discussion as well, because I think it aligns fairly well with part of what we're going to talk about today.
That's amazing, Bill. Thanks for that. Maybe put the word in the chat so we can all start using it, and it'll be in the dictionary soon.
Yeah, good idea.
I love that, though. That's great. Wellamundi. Amazing. Well, a lot of curious, concentrated, and interested and hopeful people. So that's great to hear. I'll share one more that's completely unrelated. I'm a bit nervous today because the Euros are on and Germany's playing. I won't be able to watch the game because of work, unfortunately, but so that's how I feel. And that's just one of the many words I could use because, of course, I'm also extremely excited and interested about our presentation today. Well, thank you so much. This was great. I'm happy to see that we have a super engaged and excited group today. Maybe just a couple of words about our discussion after. I just wanted to point this out right now. So before we go into the presentation, you can already think about perhaps some comments that you'd like to make later. We have 3 prompts for you that, aside from anything else you might want to share, that you could think about and that we might bring back to you later. So one is, what surprised you about the presentation that you heard? So it could be really anything, but since we're talking about whole systems change, perhaps you had some, assumptions and thoughts before that were challenged today. And so you had a little bit of a surprise moment. Please share that with us, and I'm sure Sandra can share a little bit about if that's occurred to her before, or if that's a common moment of surprise that she witnesses. The second prompt would be, what did the presentation disrupt for you? So perhaps there was anything that really shifted in your perspective, perhaps in your mindset about systems change. It could also be the total opposite. Perhaps something was reinforced for you. So maybe during the presentation, you can give this some thought and see if something comes up. And our last prompt is, how would you challenge what you heard? So this usually makes for quite exciting conversations also. So feel free if there's something where you're perhaps, have a couple follow-up questions to better understand, or you're maybe not quite sure how something would work, feel absolutely free to share those questions, and then we can discuss together. As a last little word from myself, please share in the chat while we hand over to Peter now. Please briefly share your location, your occupation, and maybe what brought you here today, just so your fellow participants can get to know a little bit about you. That'd be great. So I will stop my presentation here. If it lets me, there we go.
Okay, and Sandra can switch over to her.
Yes, Peter, over to you, please.
Okay, and Sandra, you could switch. You can, or we can just put Sandra on spotlight for a second while she gets her slides together there. And so I also want to add, before I introduce, do a personal introduction for Sandra, to just ask participants today to also, as you have questions as you go along, as kind of the next moderator, I'll be looking for questions and for points of response to Sandra's talk. So post any questions or ideas that you might have in the chat, and I'll be able to return to those, and we can incorporate those into the discussion. And so let me introduce Professor Sandra Waddock. Sandra and I had met, as well as the first time I met Sandra and Steve Waddell and a number of other people at the International Transitions Conference, Transition Sciences Conference in Ottawa, I think in 2018 or it's 2019. And so I started really looking at her work and came across Sandra's work time and time again when exploring as a scholar, looking for original citations and early work in system change. And so I think it was actually 2019 that it was the ISTN conference, because it was 2018, I think, there was a retreat on Wasson Island with a number of foundation leaders and a few of us working in systemic design that were exploring how foundations should be moving to funding system change, transformation, and not funding projects. to really to be able to more clearly envision the change that was to be proposed by the by the more transformative projects, to go beyond the project to really envisioning what it's going to take for system change and transformation. And Sandra is one of these scholars who has always been many years ahead of the field that she's writing in. So it's kind of ironic that they would even still call kind of your chair, Sandra, as social responsibility, because it sounds like a word from 20 years ago. And corporate social responsibility has moved into so many dimensions since. And Sandra has been there moving at years ahead so that this field moves into a world where the ideas can actually take shape in a more profound, transformative way. So we actually met, didn't have a lot of time to work together at the Transitions Conference, but we had the opportunity during the many Zoom meetings that people started having after March 2020. I was asked by people in the H3 Uni group that were connected to an ecological economics group that had been formed, and Sandra was part of GAIN, as was Steve Waddell. The GAIN project, headed up by Jasper Kenter in York University, UK, is the Global Assessment for New Economics. And so this was an academic project to explore the leading new heterodox and ecological and what we call new economics, but that we're moving into the world of well-being economics, flourishing economics, and all the different approaches to that. So Sandra and Steve kind of were part of a group then that we split out to form called Bounce Beyond, which was to actually take the time that we had now that we knew that we might be together for a while, for several months or more. And Bounce Beyond was then kind of a think tank to create advising, to work with like senior advisors to on developing these concepts of transformation that led to going beyond system change into what it takes for organizations and individuals participating with them to take leadership into what became framed as transformation catalysts. And this formed out of working with a number of groups through the Bounce Beyond project and trying to actually take action in system change and transformation and to put theory into practice and action. And Sandra is just an extraordinary writer. So people in Bounce Beyond had different roles. Sandra is, just extraordinary writer, not just good to read when writing, but like an article or this book that Sandra will share about just seemed to emerge. and I've as a collaborator on some of this work, I'm just always astonished at how whole the vision is, how comprehensive. And I really encourage people to get the book as well, but there is a lot to read. Our article on the Journal for Awareness-Based System Change that Sandra also led from 2 years ago, and her recent book. So I'm just really proud to have you with us in the cafe for the Flourishing Community of Practice, and we have a generous amount of time. So take the time that you'd like, and if you'd like to call for questions at any point, or if I have let me know. I think you'll take the floor for speaking, but then I'll start to harvest questions, and we'll pick that up after at a good point after your talk then. So thank you. With no further ado, Sandra.
Thank you, Peter and Tim, for that lovely introduction. Now I'm a little bit more intimidated. I want to acknowledge the land I'm sitting on, which is Wampanoag and Nipmuc lands originally. And I also want to acknowledge that Peter and I actually met in about 2007, I think it was, at David Cooper Writer's Business as an Agent of World Benefit Conference, in a group that was trying to that did come up with the idea of thrivability at the time. And Peter was the one forwarding that notion for us, although we never took it as far as we should, but it relates very much to the idea of flourishing, I think. So I also want to acknowledge that the ideas that I'm going to present today came out of the work of many people in Bounce Beyond, Peter included. And I sort of view myself as kind of a synthesizer of ideas, and I often sit in meetings and try to figure out what's going on and what the overarching theme of a meeting is. And the Bounce Beyond team met for about, I don't know, 2.5 years, and really hashed through a lot of these ideas. It was Steve Waddell's brainchild, and he brought together a group of thought leaders, and over the course of those years, we struggled with how you could develop sort of a process-oriented theory of change. Because there's, in the transitions and transformations literature, there's a whole lot of writing about the need for systemic change and about the attributes of the systems and about what it'll take to get there. But there's not really a process for catalyzing purposeful systemic change of the nature that we were envisioning in Bounce Beyond. So these ideas are meant to be applied in a variety of different contexts that help us to, see if we can get this to work, help us to deal with what we now are calling, or what is now being called, polycrisis, the simultaneous and intersecting occurrence of multiple crises at the same time, and each one of which on its own could be civilization threatening. And you can see a list of them here. I don't need to rehearse them for this crowd. I think most people are probably fairly familiar with them. But this polycrisis is something new for humanity, something that we've never really faced before. And if we're going to get to Wella Mundi, or flourishing, to use John Ehrenfeld's word, as a system, we need to be able to steward different types of change than we've been able to do in the past. And what you're seeing now in the sort of broader world is that many business associations, and one can question how legitimate and realistic this is, but many business associations are calling for transformative change, for things like circular economy, for actual system change, for dealing with issues of biodiversity, even for, in some cases, financing systemic change. You see organizations like the World Bank, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and similar sort of peak organizations, to use a term that Doug Ostrom probably is quite familiar with. Doug is on this call, who are calling for this type of change. And while I'm not sure that they actually understand fully the implications of that change and how profound the kind of change that they're calling for really is, they are aware of this polycrisis, this intersecting set of crises that we're all facing. And they are setting, and I think this is really an important aspect of this, setting a new narrative. They're putting out a new narrative. And I think that's important because new narratives are necessary as I believe one of the earlier steps in this process of transformative change that I'm going to outline here. So we're talking about not just system change. We've had lots of system changes over the years, but not many of them are actually whole system and purposeful or deliberate changes, intentional changes towards generally, if you read the literature, words like the ones on the top here, equitable, just, inclusive, eco-social flourishing, come up. And in fact, I think the emerging language actually is eco-social imaginaries, where we've always had human-oriented social imaginaries in the past. What is emerging in the last couple of years is this new language coming from the UN and other writers of eco-social imaginaries that can create new narratives that really drive very different ways of conceiving human relationships in the world. They're different for us. in sort of the dominant culture. They are not different from many indigenous peoples who already perceive themselves as part of the of this natural environment, and not as dominating it as humans do, but as but as part of it. And I'll talk a little bit about some stories that I think are out there that are really influencing how we conceive the world. And this purposeful transformative system change, I believe, can be fostered by a group of folks that we can call transformation catalysts. They can be individuals and they can be organizations. So I think about Steve Waddell bringing this group of thought leaders together that included Peter and me and a bunch of others, to really think about things in a different way. It's a catalytic function. You can't, as catalysts, control what's going to happen as a result of that, but you can bring people together in new ways for conversations and dialogical types of processes and other types of processes that enable them to come up with some new things together. And when that's oriented towards systemic change, you can begin to get much more power behind the transformation. And you do that by taking people who are already working for system change in the state that Paul Hawken in his 2007 book called Blessed Unrest, small scale individual types of enterprises that are working towards that general goal of equitable, just and socially, eco-socially flourishing worlds, but doing so separately and doing so without the sort of the collective impact that the dominant powers have. And so the reason you want to bring these groups together in new ways is to create what Steve Waddell always talks about as effective transformation systems. And that's the paper Peter referred to earlier that 4 or 5 of us published in the Journal of Awareness-Based Systems a couple of years ago, if you want to just look at that piece of it. But it's the idea that there are potential collectives of initiatives out there that, if brought together in new ways, can create much more of a powerful force for achieving transformative change. But polycrisis, that's far from the current story that we see today. We see inequality, growing inequality. We see failed governance, failed institutions all over the place. We see multiple ecological or potential ecological crises, not to mention the least of which is climate change or biodiversity loss. If some of you may remember that in 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity indicated that about 1 million species could go extinct over the next few years. We see the potential for collapsing ecosystems, marine ecosystems, forest ecosystems, desertification, and the list goes on. So I want to argue that we need to start with new stories or narratives to replace dominant ones that are currently highly flawed. And I'm going to talk briefly about 3 of those myths. These stories are so powerful that they're, by anthropologists, call them cultural mythologies. One is scientism, one is human exceptionalism, and the other is our current economic framing, neoliberalism. So scientism is the belief that only science provides useful and truthful knowledge. That belief, empirical knowledge is all that matters, is very much positivist orientation, and it totally discounts other possible ways of knowing. Philosophy, experience, sensing things, reasoning, even intuitive and creative and design ways of thinking for this crowd. The creative aspects of bringing things together in new ways to design something for the future that didn't exist in the past. None of that gets counted in scientism, not science. Science is needed. We need to understand things and find the truths that science tries to emerge. But we don't need linear reductionist thinking that fragments living systems into their parts, because that's very destructive. As we know, if you take a living system and start pulling it apart, pretty soon you don't have much of a living system anymore. So living systems require different kinds of approaches, much more systemic and holistic kinds of approaches. Human exceptionalism is the belief that we humans are somehow separate from and dominant over nature, that we should and can and ought to exploit nature's resources for our own benefits. And this linear way of linear thinking has resulted in many business practices and other agricultural practices and the like that are highly exploitive, and that don't take into account the fact of the living world that we are actually living in. My friend David Corton always says, we are living beings born of a living planet, and we forget that at our peril. And this human exceptionalism forgets that. That is just not part of that conversation. And the third cultural mythology that is so dominant is what I would call conventional economics or neoliberal economics. And that has a number of tenets, all of which are flawed. One is that the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder wealth and continuously grow economic GDP, usually as measured by GDP, economics as measured by GDP, continuously grow, despite that we live, as John Ehrenfeld has pointed out to us on in some of his wonderful work, actually, we live in a finite planet. It is based in individual responsibility, me and my benefit, my company and its benefit, but not the collective. In fact, neoliberal economics basically ignores the collective or society. The idea is, as Reagan says here, we need to keep government off our backs. This is an approach to regulatory environment, practice of the government that is laissez-faire, less government, the better. And that argues, as Margaret Thatcher once said, there's no such thing as society. So this economics sort of exists out there as an endless growth of economic activities without any regard for the consequences of that. And it does so through putting markets at the center of everything. Markets will solve, basically, in this way of thinking, all of our social and our social ills, and basically doesn't even consider the natural environment, and which it ignores as externalities. So stuff that happens that's not good in economics goes out into societies or the natural environment, where it's labeled externalities and basically then ignored because after all, we're achieving GDP growth or profitability growth or shareholder wealth maximization or whatever it is we think we're doing. And by the way, Thatcher also argued that there is no alternative to this way of thinking. However, just to give, I'm going to embed a little bit about we all through this talk to give an example of someone who's trying to counter this narrative and doing so very much through the processes, the types of processes that I'm arguing for in this catalyzing transformation approach. So we all, as the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and it's attempting to build well-being economic narratives in service to life. So this is their vision statement. We envision a world where everyone has enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness, where people can feel secure in their basic comforts and use their creative energies to support flourishing of all of life, where we thrive in a restored, safe, and vibrant natural environment because we've learned the reciprocity that many native cultures already understand. In a world where we have voice over our collective destiny. In other words, there's a democratic capacity for everyone to find their place in society and find belonging, meaning, and purpose. Now, having been involved in the very beginning of what became We All, I can tell you it took a long time to reach these kinds of statements. These are not easy to achieve. And that's why, even working with Bounce Beyond, which I also would view as a transformation catalyst, it took us a long time to figure out what the heck we were trying to do, and to come up with this sort of approach to thinking about transformative change. So We All also articulates a set of values. It's not simply a different economic system. It involves a shift in how we seek to live together. So it's a collective shared aspiration from seeing ourselves as owners and consumers to being caretakers and creators of a flourishing world. I call that process stewardship in some of the work that I've done. And they've articulated 5 core values: passions. We believe in the need for economic change. We strive to see one another's and our own humanity and act with care to meet our fundamental needs. We trust people to act in line with their values and empower them to take responsibility for their own work. We value togetherness above agreement, focus on common visions and values, and equality. We place the ecosystem above the individual ego. Now, these values the thing about values and the kind of vision that we all has articulated is it creates the possibility of a new narrative, a new way of framing the world, a new way of seeing economics. It says, yes, guess what? Maybe there are alternatives. Another one that we could look at would be Kate Ray, a similar model that's embedded in a lot of this is Kate Raworth's donut economics model, which provides a visual image. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It provides a visual image and a set of boundaries, both on society and a natural environment that we cannot exceed if we hope for human flourishing in a flourishing natural world. But that said, purposeful transformative change isn't easy. Purposeful means it's towards agreed aspirations or shared aspirations and desired ends, the kind of socially just, ecologically flourishing, inclusive societies that we, in a flourishing natural environment that we can envision. Transformation means fundamental changes in important aspects of a given system or context. I can talk about this a little bit later. Its purposes, performance metrics, the paradigms shaping the mental models that influence in turn how the system operates, creates its operating practices, and what are the power structures and relationships among actors in that system. All of that will shift if we're really undergoing a transformative change. And there are many obstacles to this, including much of the status quo thinking, the narratives that I just explained, which really prevent us in many ways until we can change them and at least be aware of what they are. They prevent us from shifting our mindsets, which is, if we remember Donella Meadows, she told us that mindset change, paradigm shift, is the first important step for effecting transformative change. So key concepts that I use and that we use, that Bounds Beyond developed, that we use in this book. Transformation means bringing fundamental changes in a given system, arena, organization, or domain. And it shifts the dimensions that I just mentioned. Transformation catalysts are those beings, people, and initiatives and organizations. You could think of the FEI in some ways as a transformation catalyst, and it's trying to bring people together in new ways. Think about what are the design aspects? How do we think about these systems to create for flourishing enterprise, which is different from maximized shareholder wealth enterprises? Bringing them together to amplify the efforts of existing initiatives, and could be new ones too, of course, in different types of contexts, so that transformative impacts can be achieved in their target systems. The goal is to emerge powerful transformation systems, which are the collection of initiatives that aim to transform shared issues, geographies, methods, sectors, strategies, some system that we want to define, to generate common aspirations so that initiatives within them are willing to work together, both work collectively and sometimes independently, to better achieve the objectives that they've set. Let me just stop there and see if there's any major burning questions. If you raise your hand, I probably can see you. No, okay. So transformation catalyst. Well, what's a catalyst? A catalyst is a medium that brings about transformational changes. In chemistry, of course, it's something you put into a chemical stew of some sort, and when you add it, it doesn't change itself, but it somehow creates a new state change in that stew. And for human catalysts, we are part of the system. We cannot sort of completely divorce ourselves from any system that we're trying to change, but we can serve to bring people, other entities, initiatives, whatever they might be, together in new ways. Transformation catalysts are systems oriented, and they're working with fundamentally with transformation, or those T systems that I just talked about. And they do it through a series of processes that I'm going to talk about: seeing and sense making, connecting, and catalyzing action. I talk about it as connecting, cohering, and amplifying transformative change. Transformation catalysts understand that the systems they're working with are complexly wicked, a combination of complex adaptive systems and wicked, combined with wicked problems. So complex wickedness means that the issues in the system, problems that we're facing, are interconnected. That's the notion of polycrisis. That they are interdependent with each other, that they are nested. So as you begin seeing here, organizations are nested within economies, which in turn are nested within societies, which in turn are nested within the natural environment. And we can't escape from that reality. That's just the way things are. They are dynamically emergent and nonlinear, with nonlinear pathways. So that if you bring catalysts together, if you bring actors together in new ways, you cannot necessarily predict what's going to happen. The systems themselves have fractal-like qualities, so there's self-similarity at lower levels to higher levels of analysis. And these fractals can create patterns and attractors that bring together people. So the catalyst is the shared aspirations, I think, are a version of the attractor. What is it that draws people together to work on the same thing? It's the shared aspiration. So if the aspiration is set as socially just, equitable, inclusive societies and flourishing natural environment, there's a lot of people that can agree that that might be a reasonable goal and come together around under that huge umbrella. And that, in fact, is what Paul Hawkins said about the blessed unrest that he uncovered in his 2007 book. They're all working towards generally the same ends. It's just that they don't know about each other and they're not willing to work together. The catalyst recognizes that reality and tries to bring them together. Systems are constantly changing and evolving. They're embedded, nested, as this diagram shows. There are no beginnings, and the wickedness means that there are no beginnings and no ends of issues, no clear stopping rule. And such systems are subject to sudden state changes, or what have been called tipping points. Therefore, we need holistic approaches. So let's go back to we all for a second here. They're shifting economics narratives, catalyzing transformation, and thereby serving as this transformation catalyst. So they've defined a well-being economy as an economy designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around. So that in that kind of economy, the rules, norms, and incentives are set up to deliver quality of life and flourishing for all people in harmony with the natural environment by default. So with that in mind, here is sort of a whole picture. And here I have to thank Peter's partner, Patricia, for these images. I wanted a picture of this that wasn't just sort of a line and chart diagram that I might be able to create. So I hired Patricia, who's a wonderful artist, and she created this picture, a couple other pictures for me. So we can see on the left bottom here, we've got the transformation catalysts who bring together people in new ways to steward change. That's part of the process. And they do that by creating new social imaginaries. Maybe I should get Patricia to add the word eco-social here, because this was written before that language really started to evolve. And they do it through processes of connecting, cohering, and amplifying the work of people who are already in this web that's in the middle, but connecting them in new ways and helping them to cohere their understandings and their visioning and their actions in what we'll label as a coherent transformation system to get to a transformed system on the upper left-hand side here. So what a catalyst does. So the connecting process, I think, has two main elements. One is seeing the system, which helps participants learn about, understand, describe, and figure out what's going on in the system. Who is in the system? What are they doing? Where are the issues in the system? And to do that, you have to sort of define some boundaries around the system, which of course is going to be our imposition of boundaries around the system, because if they're truly organic systems, they're open systems, and but we have to have some sort of set of boundaries. So for we all's case, it's about economics, well-being economics. So it's not about everything. It sort of is about everything, but it's not about everything. It's defined, the limits of what their particular action set is oriented towards is around economic activities. And so you can do some mapping. Steve Waddell is a great proponent of systems mapping and stakeholder identification processes. And by the way, Peter, you can put your name or your book in the chat, if you will, because Peter has brought together in his wonderful book about, I think it was 127 of these different approaches that can be used to do some of these processes. So it isn't about one process, it's about understanding that one of the initial steps in this process of transformative system change is understanding the system, seeing the system, figuring out who's in it, who can help, where are the allies. You don't want to necessarily go with the people who would object to the kinds of changes that you're advocating, but you want to find the allies, people who are already working towards these kinds of system change. And in doing that, you're beginning to do the sense-making process, making sense for the community. You're making meaning out of these sort of individual actors that weren't connected before, but you're in the connecting process, you're beginning to connect them. You're creating new narratives and visuals or graphics of the system. And that includes, oops, I'm not sure that's the next one. So we all defines and understands the focal system. What is the economy? It's the way we produce and provide. It's the provisioning activities that we're in. We think of it as fixed, but it's not. It's not unchangeable. The social rules and norms that underpin our current system were designed by people, and that means they can be changed by people. And a lot of, if I talk to my MBA students or undergraduate students, they think the economy is a given. It's immutable. This is the way it is. It came somehow from nature, and this is the way it is and the way it has to be. And so part of the learning that they have to go through is to recognize that we created this system. We humans created this system. We can change it. So then they define a well-being economy designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around. The rules, norms, and incentives are set up to deliver the quality of life and flourishing for all people in harmony with the environment by default. In other words, not exploitive, something different. Regenerative is the word that is being often used today. Why do we need such an economy? Well, we all says it directly addresses the root problems of our society and the polycrisis that we're facing, putting our fundamental needs for dignity, nature, purpose, fairness, and participation, those are their core values, at the core of activities and getting things right the first time around. It's a design challenge. It's the kind of design challenge that FEI is designed to grapple with. So here's the whole set of processes that transformation catalysts use. The connecting process involves seeing and sense making. The cohering process involves co-creative visioning and planning coherent actions. And the amplification process takes those action plans, implements them, experiments, learns from them and measures what's going on, and then recognizes that, if we're working at a whole system level, there's probably a number of subsystems, and those subsystems may need their own catalytic action. And so emerging new infrastructure as necessary, and allowing new transformation catalysts and transformation systems to emerge at different levels of the system, presumably a little bit smaller or less in scope than the main system that you would start with, whichever that is. Although you could start small and build out too. So several years ago, I asked, we all was good enough to give me the messaging that initiatives, they at the time, I think had about 150, 200 members. Now they have like 450 members. But they presented, here's why I want to join, here's my aspiration for joining WEAL, and they vetted people by these things. So I took those 150, 200 statements and I analyzed them, and what emerged were 4 different messages. One in the bottom left is the market-centric, business as usual, basically. It's neoliberal economics. More of that in these initiatives was a statement of the problem. So they were seeing that business as usual, neoliberal economics, with its self-interested, market-driven growth orientation is a problem. And they know it needs to change, but some of them didn't really articulate what those changes would be. But the other 3 articulate 3 different visions, collective visions of what that might look like. One on the bottom right is people-centric. I called it the good life, people and community well-being oriented, but largely still a socialist, creates social imaginaries, human-centric social imaginaries. And then there were on the upper left, the initiatives that articulated we need to operate within planetary boundaries. We need to learn to be in more harmony with nature and similar kinds of messages. And I call that nature-centric. The one that intrigued me most, however, was the one on the upper right, which is what I ended up calling ecological civilization. It's people and nature-centric. It's integrated. And it takes life as its core. It's holistic. And it says the economy is part of this bigger picture, but by no means should dominate it, and by no means should be the most central aspects of what we're doing, even though we do need the provisioning services that economies provide. We need to do that in the context of regenerative actions. So connecting and seeing the system helps participants learn about, visualize, and describe, better understand what's happening in the system. The sense-making is the meaning-making process, helps us to make sense of the system, providing new narratives or visuals or graphics that help us understand the system. It's why I hired Patricia to write those graphics, because in seeing what had happened with a number of initiatives, the visual is really important, and particularly I have always been particularly struck by the visual that the planetary boundaries framework provided, and then that Kate Raworth developed into donut economics, because it immediately, just looking at that image, tells us, and that's where design thinking becomes so important. It immediately tells us what we need to be paying attention to and what are the parameters and boundaries that are important here. Connecting means convening. It's a convening process. Convening key actors in a context to create understanding by developing these seeing and sense-making kinds of activities. So you could start with a bunch of questions. Who's in the system? What people, groups, NGOs, businesses, governmental agencies need to be connected to make transformation happen more effectively? What are the new stories and new narratives that we need to tell? How do folks understand the current system and what its needs are and what needs to change? And obviously any number of other questions associated with those. The cohering part of catalytic action involves visioning processes. So you'll often find in these kinds of processes, people coming together to engage in any number of types of visioning. One that is particularly powerful, I think, is the 3 horizons visioning process, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. And I think that's particularly powerful because it envisions the current destructive path that we're on and the problems associated with it. And it does this all in one diagram. It envisions the aspirations that we can all hope to achieve together, and in the upside down U, the normal curve, it says here are some entities that are pulling us backwards towards the existing system, and here are some entities that can be forwarded to push us more towards the aspirational system. I think that's a great way of visualizing what we're trying to do. However, there are any number of others. You could use World Cafe, you could use appreciative inquiry, you could use Otto Scharmer's Theory U. So there are any number of these kinds of things, and Peter has identified all of these in his book. And then, because you've brought people together in this cohering process into dialogue to dialogical and conversational processes, co-envisioning. This is all co-created, and you, as the catalyst, if you're one individual or an organization, you don't necessarily have control over what they're imagining and what they hope to do. You're bringing them together, and you're allowing the emergence of what they plan, and that takes the shape of action planning. Okay, what can we do both collectively and independently, following our own agendas, because these organizations they're independent organizations. They're not necessarily in any kind of hierarchical relationship. And the transformation catalysts do not necessarily have hierarchical authority over any of these. So you have to do this through inspiration and co-envisioning and collaborative kinds of processes. And so cohering means bringing these participants together to create synergies, harmonies, take collaborative actions, and identify and address gaps and act on shifting transformation priorities, to identify them and then begin to act on them. So it's co-creating, Steve and Peter and I, with Ian Kendrick, identified 6 areas that almost every whole system is going to be dealing with. One I've already talked about a little bit, is narrative. One is capacity building, including the collaborative capacity to work together, leadership, structural changes. How do you make these things come about? An important one is measurement, evaluation, research, and learning. This idea of MERL comes from our friend Zenda Ophir, who is an evaluation specialist. But it's this holistic forms of measurement need to be built in right at the start, so you know whether or not you're moving the system towards the desired ends. How do you resource and finance this? This is, I think, I always identified as a huge problem, because I think Tim said early in the introduction, most financing is for programs, it's not for a whole system change. And so how do you begin moving funders towards thinking about whole system change? Innovation and governance, what changes need to be made? Obviously, there's a lot of innovation in a transformative change. And then how do you govern this whole system? So questions for cohering could be what visioning processes might be collaboratively or co-creatively developed, what processes should be used. And again, there's no dictate of any one process here, many that are potentially useful. What action plans can these initiatives co-develop now and in the future for greater collective and independent transformative impact? So these are the kinds of guiding questions you could use in dialogues with people you've cohered, you've brought together. And amplification involves the implementation and development of transformation infrastructure. So that means co-creating processes to aid the implementation of transformative actions. That's the catalytic function. Bring these folks together in new ways, let them figure out where the leverage points in the system are that can create change. Is it in creating local food sources? Is it in, if you're dealing with a food system, is it in creating more democratic voice or participative capacities for people in the system? What is it? Help them emerge and develop effective transformation T-systems that is to create, bring together the transformation entities so that they're now aware of themselves as a T-system and can begin to continue to work together later on as effective change agents. And in the process, as I said earlier, develop new transformation infrastructure as needed in the system and in different parts of the system, which could be sort of, the economic system, the finance system, the marketing system of a company, for instance, or in the communities. And in communities, you might have people working with the educational system, linked to the social services sector. My friend Mary Walsh at Boston College, where I work, has developed a program called City Connects, in which each student, it's in the educational, she's in the School of Education, and she goes into, this system goes into struggling, often inner city education systems, and gives each student an evaluation and says, what will it take for this this student in particular to be able to flourish in school? Maybe it's an art program, maybe it's music, maybe it's drawing, maybe it's reading. What is it that this child needs? And what social services and other services that are in the community can be brought together in new ways so that that this student and all the other students in this class get the services that they individually need. It's an amazing program, and it's clearly a catalytic type of action that's going on. And she's been developing this program probably for 30 years now. I commend it to you if you're interested in how schools can actually be transformed. And what City Connects is doing is developing that transformation infrastructure. So in place then in these schools is new structures so that the next year's class can tap into, students entering, can tap into an existing system that already is connected with all the social services that students might need. So shared visions at the school level, shared visions at the whole system level, and then at the whole City Connects level. So catalytic action of amplifying involves implementing, experimenting, and learning, co-created action plans with an experimenting orientation. Nothing's set in stone here. There's going to be failures. Things are not necessarily going to work every time. How do you figure out what happened and learn from them? And then emerging those subsystems that I just talked about. So some questions you could ask would be, how and when can action plans be implemented? Who does that? How will you evaluate their impact holistically and systemically? Here there's some, Michael Quinn Patton has developed some holistic approaches, one of which is called Blue Marble evaluation, which is a principles-based approach to evaluation that is very useful in this kind of holistic context. And what new infrastructure, transformative, connective infrastructure needs to be in place. So in the case of City Connects, that's the existing links now with the social services that are provided by the schools, which previously existed in their own little isolated bailiwick, and now have this whole system of existing services that were not previously connected. So Peter, how am I doing on time here?
I'd say another 5 or 10 minutes would be fine.
Okay, great, thank you.
10. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so We All does this in a variety of ways. So they've created a whole number of these connecting, coherent amplification processes. One is that they've got now 13 local hubs with many more developing that are We All oriented. They can be regional, they can be country-based, they can be city-based, they can be bioregional based. They hope to link local to global efforts to shift towards what they're calling the well-being economy. They've got a governmental sector. National and regional governments are collaborating and adopting the idea of well-being economies with this sort of shared ambition, and that's the envisioning process. And I can tell you from having been in the background on a lot of this took years to really think through. But they've got a number of countries that have actually agreed to this: Scotland, Iceland, Wales, New Zealand, and Finland. Canada is also very active in different ones. And there are a couple cities in California working with initiative EcoCiv, the Ecological Institute for Ecological Civilization, where whole cities are adopting this language of well-being economies and pushing towards the state of California, which is one of the biggest economies in the United States, adopting that similar language. They have a policymakers networks, and they have a group of ambassadors, that'd be people like Peter and me, who are involved with them in helping to give input as needed over time. So the transformation, I think, starts with narrative change to create the paradigm shift that Meadows told us was so important. So We All works explicitly to shift the narrative. So in the yellow here, an economy that exploits the natural world in the most marginalized most marginalized peoples to the point of collapse is what they're working against. They are shifting towards the economy that argues for well-being. By changing, they say at the bottom here, by changing the narrative, we can make a well-being economy, make it make common sense the way neoliberal economies do now. And I can tell you from previous research that that neoliberal economic narrative has been deliberately foisted upon us over the last 75, 80 years. And because of the fragmentation in the, I will say, the well-being economics or the progressive economics, we have not yet, until we all comes along, come up with a common narrative that we can enjoy together, and that would provide an alternative. That's why the narrative is so important. We all is attempting to transform businesses beyond profit to well-being. My friends Tom Donaldson and Jim Walsh in 2005 wrote a great article called "Toward a Theory of Business," in which they argue that the purpose of business is not to maximize shareholder wealth, but rather to create what they termed collective value, absent dignity violation. So very much aligned with the "we all" notion. And in fact, some of that language has been, I think, adopted from some of these ways of thinking. And they on the website, We All offers a number of case examples of where these ideas are actually being put into practice. So it's time for a system reset from our mechanistic, dominating, linear, and sort of dead way of thinking about the world, sort of everything in squares, everything in rectangles, all sorts of straight lines, to far more organic ways of considering our place in the world, our thinking and our narrative, to the harmony of humans and nature, to the recognition that we people are part of nature, to understanding the complexity and connectedness of everything in the world, and that when we do stuff that's harmful over here, there are going to be implications long-term over there, towards thinking in relational integrated wholes that are actually living. So that's the whole process. And Peter, I think maybe I'll stop there. I have more, well, let me just say one more thing. You can't do this without adopting a set of what I call design guidelines. So there are four big ones, and they're adopting principles that give life to systems, using values-driven change processes. So when we think about just, equitable societies in a flourishing natural environment, those are core values that we need to articulate and carry with us. Taking complexity-based systems, systemic-based systems approaches, and using not leadership, because it's not about one person, but it's about stewardship. So there's a set of design principles that fit with each of these that I'm just gonna, I'll leave that up and you can take a look at it. But the processes that we use to catalyze systemic change need to keep these types of design guidelines in mind, plus any others that are contextually relevant, of course. But they need to keep these kinds of processes in mind. So why don't I stop there and see if there are any questions? I haven't been able to follow any possible questions. And I will say that I'm not an active participant in a lot of these things. I participated in Bounce Beyond. I've been in the background of We All. I'm on the board of EcoCiv, the Institute for Ecological Civilization, and actually, way back when, I studied business engagement in schools for my dissertation, and ultimately wrote a book called Not by Schools Alone, which I think has been used as a founding document for the City Connects program. So I'm behind the scenes. I consider myself an observer of what's going on rather than an actual participant. So I'm going to stop sharing, Peter. Is that okay?
Okay, good. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations. It covers so many of the transformative ideas that are in the book. I mean, so many of them are familiar to me, but there may be where the general trend of the ideas may be familiar to a lot of the participants that we have a great group of participants in the audience today too. Just a really amazing audience today for you. So I'm very curious as to what their questions and comments might be even first. So I'd like to open up to them. I have a few questions of my own that, of course, I think would come out. But I mean, so I'll just say that there might be some very particular questions that people had or that would want to hear a little bit more on, from the different areas that you suggested. So there's been a lively discussion in the chat, but a lot of it has been around what your ideas are leading to thinking about, as opposed to clarifications. It's having a fractal effect. So let's open it up then to anyone who'd like to ask, have a conversation with Sandra. So,
Goran?
Goran, your hand went up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It's a pleasure to hear it. And I remember when I was doing my master's at the OCAD SFI, the Waddock and Waddock papers were always eye-opening. So it's a pleasure to see how the work evolves. I have a question about the nature of really indefinite boundaries and the nestedness that you talked about. So if we think of then the transforming the whole system, how do we think about the boundaries and defining where is the appropriate set of those boundaries that we're going to be working with?
Yeah, I mean, that's up to each group. So I think you have to start out with some understanding of where your expertise is, where the people that you want to bring in. Are you interested in the food system? Are you interested in the social system? Are you interested in the educational system? Now, obviously, all of those have links to all of the others, but it's so the boundaries get defined by the people who are the transformation system, if you will. So, and it's important to put some sort of boundaries on it, so you're not just putting a collection of every possible change entity that's out there, so that you have, at least at the start, some sort of sense of what is the nature of the system you're dealing with. So in Weall's case, it was the economic system. They said, look, this neoliberal narrative is really problematic. Hunter Lovins was one of the people initially behind this, and and Michael Pearson, who has developed the whole idea of humanistic management. So between the two of them and people like me and Steve Waddell, we the well-being, the idea of well-being economy sort of came into being, and you, at least in the start, you're limiting it to economic activities, because the boundary sets what comes in and what doesn't, who comes in and who doesn't come in, or what issues come in and what issues don't come in, at least at some level. I don't know if that helps. Goran, is it?
Yeah, very much. Thanks so much.
John?
Oh.
Oh, you're muted. You're on mute, John.
Okay, thank you. Just for a minute, I want to just talk about catalysts. Now, what a catalyst does is take a system that is sort of wanting to change, that is in a system of far from equilibrium, but there's an energy or some kind of barrier, and it gets it over that barrier. But the conditions for change are already present. Well, that's not what I hear here. And I wondered, to what extent is it important that there is some positions of authority and intention to change? And how effective is it going to be for a group at the local level to begin working on their own without any higher level or more authoritative change, either at that level and particularly at higher levels? Because your idea of nested panarchies, these nested complex systems,
Yeah.
there's a great deal of interaction. So anyway,
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, I think. I think you want to start at the highest level, it makes sense, and bring in the allies that you might have in, I don't know, regulatory agencies or government entities of various sorts, who are allies, who are already, so I think the readiness factor is really important. And that's probably something that's not emphasized enough in this framework. But the whole notion of the transformation system is finding those entities that are already working towards this and bringing them together to collectively enhance their capacity for power at whatever level of analysis you're working at that makes sense. I think a lot of people think you can do this from the bottom up. I'm possibly less optimistic about that. I more agree with you that you need at some point to be starting that's why I think why we all, for instance, started at the country level. It's why the City Connects program goes in at the superintendent level to a whole system, not just to one school. I think they initially started in one school, but to make these systems really effective, you need to be doing it at the whole system level. And in the case of the educational system, that would be through the superintendent of schools and allies to that. So yeah, it's important to bring in as many power actors as possible, but also thinking about those design principles that I put up. One of the things that's likely to happen when you bring actors at different sort of authority levels together is that the people with authority are going to try to dominate the system. So you need to be very clear that everyone's voice gets heard in equal ways in the process of co-creating the ideas and the solutions that you hope to implement. So it's complex. I don't think it's messy. I think there's probably capacity for lots of failures. We all, I think it took years like I said, it took years for we all to get to the point where it is today. It didn't happen overnight. It bounced beyond. Putting these ideas together took us 2.5 years just to become the least bit clear on what we were doing. So, it's not easy.
Yeah, and John, I put in the chat a link to a strategic planning report that came out of 2 years of our work with Seafood Source, a seafood sustainability strategy, which was part of a foundation-funded program that it was one of our actual clients during the time that we had a lot of potential clients. We had a lot of small projects that we contributed to and developed these ideas from. But in terms of a case that extended over a period of time, had a serious deliverable, had ongoing, workshops and meetings. If you think about global seafood sustainability, it's, it was, you've got several major buyers. Even Walmart was involved. Largest seafood buyer probably in the world. So one of the foundations, but it's the hundreds of NGOs, each one of which has their own theory of change, their own, we didn't have hundreds in each meeting, but we had people that represented multiple NGOs. And over the period of the 2 years, it was this idea that they were being swept in, as a systems approach. There were, probably 120 different sustainable seafood NGOs. And yet Sandra pointed out the 6 challenge areas that were developed out of defining the narrative, a narrative that would, flow for the future, the innovation, governance, the measurement and evaluation, capacity building, finance. And all of those actually came both bottom up and top down. We think they're really validated because out of the 3 horizons strategic workshops we did, which are actually from the seafood participants, not from us, these categories came out as the needs, and they were also then developed as principles. And so it's a really kind of strongly validated set of these 6 areas that transformation catalysts can actively work on and with organizations. So I put a link to that report for people that might want to get an idea of.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder.
Thanks, Peter. Your case is, I'm not. I see the wonder of all this for situations where the purpose has already been set, and there's some sort of friction that's holding back the progress toward changing the system to provide that. But your first slide, Sandra, was about polycrises. You know, I feel a little bit of disjoint here that yes, you know, certainly Homer Dixon knows about this, but is there a group that's like your seafood folks that were perhaps driven by the economic concerns that there wasn't going to be any seafood to make profits on as part of this? Is there any similar notion at the level that of flourishing? This sort of, that was where we started.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about that.
Yeah,
you know,
so one of,
okay.
yeah, thank you, John. One of the things that I've been involved in for the last 2.5 years is an IPBES assessment, an Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services assessment on transformative change. And I'm not allowed at this point to talk about the content of it until it's been approved. However, I can tell you that it's a holistic assessment of the landscape of transformative change ideas and notions, including this one, but there's many others, obviously. And that has the weight of the United Nations and the countries behind it. So from an authority point of view, assuming this passes the plenary session, which is not until December, there will be out there then a sort of an authoritative look at transformative change and a sort of statement of the need for transformative change that picks up on the 2019 IPBES assessment and really focuses in on transformative change and the processes associated with it. And that does have the authority of countries and the UN behind it in a way that that many, you know, the others, like we could look at Kate Rayworth's donut model, and the city of Amsterdam has adopted that model and is doing a lot to implement it. So you have governmental authorities involved within the constraints of the city of Amsterdam. So you have the kind of actors that you need involved in the conversation in those discussions. And I think so. I think your point is well taken. You need to have those power players. What isn't always present is the dominant sort of the finance community and the dominant sort of huge multinational corporations, which have a lot of power. And why you need to cohere the actors that are trying to make these changes is just because of the recognition of the power that these big dominant entities have. And, you know, you can't continue to exist in blessed unrest if you hope to begin to change the system. So, you know, and it, you know, so far it's the best I know, best way I know, but it, you know, it's far from perfect.
Would anybody else? We've got maybe time for one or two more questions. There's a bit of a discussion in the chat about relationship to power and authority, and I was just going to say something about that the transformation catalyst really is a kind of small, soft power intervention that can really spread from a fractal just through, you know, so,
yeah, I talk,
right. Oh, and Stephen, good.
Yeah,
okay.
and I talk in the book. I talk about the fact that these are under-organized systems. So Dave Brown years ago talked about how you cope in under-organized systems. So what you're trying to do with the notion of the transformation system is bring some organization to it, and you do that without the transformation catalyst doesn't have the authority to bring people together. It has to be through the kind of visioning and shared aspirations and shared agendas that people come together on their own. Stephen?
Yes, thank you, Sandra. Appreciate it. Thank you, first and foremost, for the presentation on Wheel. It's been really, really stimulating. My brain's popping all over the place. But I was somewhat struck by your final, or one of your closing comments, which was that you said that you kind of stand back as an observer of all of this. And I wonder what you mean by that. And I wonder why you maintain that observer position when we're all in this together and collapse is unfolding. And if we don't change the game, if we're not changing the game together now, what are we doing?
Yeah. So my observer status is that I'm not the person going out to do the implementation of these things, but I'm watching it and I'm articulating it in ways that I don't see other people doing. So, I mean, I think there's roles for lots of different types of people in these kinds of processes. So I don't mean that I'm not engaged. I was fully engaged in Bounce Beyond. Early on, I was fully engaged with We All, trying to help them evolve. I'm on the board of EcoCiv and engaged with their processes. So I'm engaged, but I'm not the person who goes out and, if you're working with water systems, I'm not going out and measuring the water system. That type of, so that's what I mean by that.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Susan?
Hi, Sandra. I'm really thrilled to see the body of work that's been shared today because it's so resonant for me. My question is, have you had the experience or have you seen agendas being hidden agendas, if you will, or actually not hidden agendas by those who are gaining from the current narrative?
Yes, you see, yes.
And I can unpack that a little bit for
Yeah,
you.
go ahead.
I'll give you an example. So from a lot of my research in my MRP was around what was going on in the aging space. And I articulated that there needs to be will, government will. We've got experts in the system. We have so many people in the system who all aspire for a better system of care, if you will, of what's happening in our communities around aging. I see so many stakeholders involved, so many people who are driving in a positive direction, but until you reveal the agendas of the developers and the people that have profit to gain from building these institutions, if you will, I don't know how we shift that. And I'm thinking that your amplification idea there, when enough voices are there in the public and they're sort of in this sort of environment where oh my gosh, if we don't do something, there's going to be a perception that will push them to change rather than them coming forward and saying, oh my gosh, what we're doing is actually wrong, because nobody wants to look bad.
Right.
So,
I think you're absolutely right. You shift the narratives to get enough people on board with the new narrative that the laggards, if you will, have to come along with you at some point. Steve often, I hated this model, but Steve often talked about the marketing model of early adopters and the gap between where these early adopters were and the mass of people. But once the if you think about that language, once the early adopters start shifting the narrative in this new language, well-being economy, no one ever heard of it before 2017. And now it's out there in the world in a way that it never would have been. And donut economics, similar. I mean, they're overlapping in many ways. And, so the idea that there was no alternative was very dominant from Reagan Thatcher onward, up till about that time when alternatives that had some power to them started to be articulated. There were alternatives. There was ecological economics. There was this. There was that. There's all the GAIN global assessment for a new economics assessment identified 37 different economic framings. Well, that's a problem. We got to have one or two that can counter. And then you've got people saying, well, I want this well-being economics. And then once you've got enough clout behind that in some way, then you can pull along the laggards who are going to be the people who are currently benefiting from the system. Why would they change?
exactly.
Well, thank you all. I think this has been so much fun.
Wonderful.
Tim, I turn it
Thank
back
you
to you, I
so,
guess.
so much. Yes. Thank you so, so much, Sandra, for your amazing presentation. I think it was really exceptional in the way that, like Peter said before in the chat, we almost didn't have any questions of clarification, but it was so thought-provoking that people immediately engaged in discussions. And I think that already shows how much of an active role you play in really, bringing this out into the world. It happened today in the meeting. So
I wonder if
thank
you
you
could,
so.
if you could copy out the chat and send it to me, because I don't have time to look at it.
We'll do that for sure.
Before it
Yes, and
goes
we'll
away.
also hopefully, if that's okay with you, if you could send us the presentation, we could share it with the audience in an
Okay,
email.
I'll
after
send
the
you a
meeting.
PDF because it's got so many pictures in it. It's not going to translate well.
That's great. That's
Okay.
great. Yes. In the interest of time, we'll skip the brief updates that we had today. I think this discussion was much more valuable and fruitful than that. Just a little reminder that we will be entering our summer break for 2 months now. So stay in touch with us in whichever way you'd like. As we always say, we're always open for you to connect with us, share updates on opportunities for collaboration, questions, any feedback you might have for us, and also suggest any innovations, research, any projects that we should be aware of in the interest of flourishing. And then we hope to see you all back after our summer break with our new programming. So thanks again to you, Sandra. Thanks to you, Peter. And thanks to everyone for being here today. We hope you enjoyed it, and have a great summer.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.